atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is educator, researcher, and writer Sarah Tal. Her latest book is Crossing the Line, Finding America in the Borderlands, which Kirkus Reviews called a powerful expose of the human costs of America's immigration policies. Sarah Tal, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Michael. I'm so delighted to be with you today.
I wanted to start with how you approach this topic, because at the very beginning of your book, you write that your goal is to humanize today's immigration debate through the transformative power of storytelling. And I thought that would be a good point of entry for us, because I think it encompasses not only what you hope to do, but how you go about doing it as well. So can you talk a little bit about your approach in writing the book?
Sure. Mike, in my experience, the best, most effective way to touch hearts and change minds is through the stories of people that such things like our immigration policies affect. Too much of our narrative around the issue, too much of our discourse is between people who are making decisions about other people's lives, not about the lives that are affected by our policies themselves. Too much of policy making, for example, is done in offices in Washington by people who are not going to the border and seeing the effects on real human lives of what our policies exact. So my mission with this was to rehumanize the debate by putting the issue into the voices of those who are most affected and or most impacted. And by that, I took as my main focus the folks who are caught under the knee of our cruel system, but also those who are modeling for us every day that there is a better way, that we can welcome with dignity, and that we would all be better for it. So I interviewed both folks on the move, as well as those who are our first responders, if you will, in the borderlands, really modeling what I think would be a better way forward for our nation.
Yeah, and I think that approach makes your book different and gives it a depth that I don't see in a lot of the reporting and coverage and analysis of this. And so I wanted to bring it up right from the get-go. But getting into the sort of substance, the meat of things, when we talk about the border these days, we tend to focus on the current situation. And of course, that's understandable. But that, I think, often comes at the expense of understanding the history of how we got to this point. And I know that's a concern of yours. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you feel this history matters and whether or not you think it's been a big enough part of the conversation to this point.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The history matters because much of what we're dealing with today is a result and a consequence of U.S. foreign and economic policies dating back as far as the Monroe Doctrine, perhaps even earlier. Right from the banana wars through the dirty wars, continuing through the era of the so-called drug wars and the war on terror, what one scholar more appropriately calls the Securocratic War. This is part of U.S. history that is little discussed. I go so far as to say it is non-existent in our high schools, for example, though there is significant and excellent scholarship by professors of Latin American history at college and university levels. Even that is an area of study that didn't exist until folks coming of age during the Dirty War era, like myself, created some of the first departments, right? It's important to understand. It's also important to understand because the fall of the Berlin Wall ushered us into a whole new paradigm where so-called security has become paramount and has overridden our 20th century commitment to universal human rights. And I don't think enough people are really focused on that and discussing that. it's almost like, the book bans and the bans against teaching in high schools about our past as an enslaving and a nation that enslaved people. It's almost like, the idea of what might be called U.S. imperialism, really, no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to touch it.
Yeah, well, when I think about the history of our involvement in the south of the border, I'll say, one of the things, at least more recently, that comes to mind, a big deal, and most people would say a positive thing, at least for American consumers, is NAFTA and trade policy. And I never, though, had thought all that much about the linkages between NAFTA and particularly something that I wasn't familiar with really at all, that you touch on in the book, not touch on, but talk about in the book, called Operation Gatekeeper. And so I was hoping you could explain how these things influence migration in the United States in our current situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big question. The short answer is that free trade agreements such as NAFTA have effectively forced human displacement, leading to the northward migration that, continues to grow year on year. Operation Gatekeeper, which was enacted in 1994, was an attempt to stop that migration. So that sort of concretized our national habit vis-a-vis immigration to not ask the right questions. By way of a longer answer, first we must acknowledge that from the 60s, more or less, some U.S. jobs have been lost to technological advancements, right? But many others were lost to agreements such as NAFTA, which opened the borders to free and unfettered moving of goods and money. From January 1994, NAFTA incentivized corporations to move to the global south. Promises like no taxes, low wages, little to no environmental regulations. These were good for the corporate bottom line, but it wasn't necessarily good for people on the ground. So this is when we see the proliferation of the Mexican maquiladoras, for example, as well as the birth of special economic zones in Honduras and elsewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean. They had a habit of taking over ancestral lands, of the ability to pollute the water, the ability to not provide a living wage for the local workers they hired, and the failure to support local infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, roads, markets. All of these factors contributed to forcing human displacement even before climate change began to wreak havoc on what is considered the world's fruit, coffee, and sugar belts. So these forces, coupled with the southward exportation of U.S. agricultural surpluses, really destroyed small and subsistence farming economies. A prime example being when a NAFTA-related influx of U.S. corn was dumped upon the Mexican market just after the signing of NAFTA. Prices paid to small and peasant growers plunged 66%, driving the country's agricultural economy into chaos. So from the mid-1990s, more or less, hundreds of thousands of farmers have been forced to abandon family lands and search for work elsewhere. Some of them migrated to urban areas to work in factories for pennies. Others migrated to the maquiladora sweatshops erected in northern Mexico. Still others headed for El Norte, where farm workers have long kept our economy churning, right, through seasonal and, it must be said, highly exploitable agricultural employment. So then came Operation Gatekeeper. 6 months after NAFTA became part of our culture, Operation Gatekeeper was a response to this uptick in northward migration. It closed to people the very same borders that the neoliberal economic experiment displaced. Even as goods and money could cross the line unfettered, people could not. So this was one of several moments in our history, I think, when we might have stopped to ask, why are so many people on the run? And responded to that. But instead, with Operation Gatekeeper, we only asked, how do we stop them? And that's the question we keep asking today. So Operation Gatekeeper was founded on this theory called prevention through deterrence, right? And it goes like this. if we make northward migration as painful and perilous and dangerous and soul-destroying as possible, folks who survive it, because it was intended to possibly kill, will send word back home. Do not come. Do not come. But it has never worked except to kill and cause terrible, terrible human misery. Prevention through deterrence is a abject failure.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, but I'm glad you brought it up, because when I think I hear that argument a lot on the left, but when I talk to people on the right, I think they're more inclined to say about deterrence what G.K. Chesterton said about Christianity, right? That it hasn't been tried and found ineffective, but it's been found difficult and so not fully tried. And so the argument on the right seems to be, well, we just need to do a lot more, because still clearly a lot of people are getting through. And if we really crack down in a way we never have before, that's going to work. And I'm sure you've heard that argument plenty of times yourself. What's your response to that?
Well, of course, I absolutely don't agree. I mean, prevention through deterrence kills. Prevention through deterrence creates unbelievable misery. And I think that many, especially on the right, and unfortunately deeply embedded in the Christian right, have been so enriched by the border industrial complex that prevention through deterrence spawned that they're loath to see it go, right? I mean, pundits and politicians love to decry our system, which is built on prevention through deterrence, as quote unquote broken. But the fact of the matter is it is working just fine for the demagogues and profiteers who benefit from it. We saw this most recently when the extremist Republicans backed out of Biden's border deal, which honestly was terrible because it included all the law and order provisions the extreme right wanted. But as a result, they have spent years, dating to the Reagan 80s, in fact, developing a propaganda machine to whip up a moral panic, to dupe the U.S. voter into fearing the newcomer, to make us believe that we are under threat of an invasion. But I've been to the border, Mike. I've crossed the line numerous times. There is no invasion. There are only folks running from harm and hunger and horror, just as our ancestors did. They are mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunties, uncles. They're carrying all they own on their backs. They're not arriving in tanks. They're carrying their children in their arms, not weapons in their arms. And the way we treat them is unconscionable. Our laws actually prevent us from treating even terrorists and convicted felons the way we treat folks who are seeking safety at our shores. It defies the values of our Constitution, no matter how flawed it is. It defies the teachings of all the world's religions, all our perennial philosophies, and it defies moral decency. It has not worked. We've tried this experiment for a long time now, 40 years. And all we're doing is killing more people and creating more misery. I don't think that's the kind of people we want to be.
And, well, let's assume all of that is correct, and I'm probably a lot more comfortable assuming that than a lot of folks on the right. But I think there's still folks who would say, well, okay, but if people get into this country illegally in an undocumented way, however it happens, we still need to have some way of keeping track of who those people are. And of course, it's been argued that what's been called, and I hate the term, but it's a familiar term to people, so I'll use it, catch and release, which basically is letting people awaiting asylum hearings kind of go where they will, is not only an open invitation to more illegal migration or undocumented migration, but it creates a system where, a not insignificant percentage of asylum seekers don't end up showing for their court dates. And so this is not a sustainable way, a sensible way of dealing with a large inflow. And I agree with you. I don't like the term invasion, but a large number of people coming into the country. What do you think about that?
Well, all due respect, Mike, your question is flawed.
Okay.
You're conflating two realities. And this is what we're hearing in the media disinformation machine. There is one track in your question, which is the asylum track. And then there's the other track, which is coming into the country undetected. Those are two different realities. Asylum, let's start with asylum. Asylum is not illegal. And so to put asylum and illegality into the same frame is just flawed from the get-go. Also, the data from reliable sources, not from, Tanton Network-inspired anti-immigrant so-called think tanks, which Trump relies on or relied on, but the data of reliable sources show again and again and again that asylum-seeking families and individuals do show up for their court dates. They did so pre-Trump 98% of the time. And why shouldn't they? Logically, to live in the shadows, to live a life of fear that you could be caught up in an ice dragnet and deported away from your family at any time, to live only able to work under the table and be completely exploited, that's no life. People don't want to live like that. If they're after asylum, if they're credible for asylum, they want asylum, and they want to become contributing members of this society. They don't want to live in the shadows. That's a life in limbo and a life of fear. Now, the other side of that frame, moving across the borders between ports of entry without processing or detection, that has been labeled illegal since 1924, right? That's the first time we start to see in our laws a label like alien being applied to a human being. But everyone the world over has had the legal right to request asylum since the ratification of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which you'll recall was a result of our shame for having turned Jewish refugees away back to their deaths in Nazi concentration camps. The global powers after World War II got together and said, we can never let that happen again. So they created the Refugee Convention, they created the Global Refugee Protection Regime, and since 1980, with the U.S. Refugee Act, we've signed that into our laws as well. The law says that anyone with their feet on U.S. soil has the right to request asylum, no matter their means of arrival, even if they came through between ports of entry. When we request asylum, the law obliges the government to which we've made that request to honor it and adjudicate the claim. From that distinct moment, we are tracked. We are effectively tracked because we're in the system. Catch and release, as you point out, is a heinous and misleading label. It's as heinous and misleading as alien or illegal to refer to a human. And it is a media myth. It might have been a thing before the creation of ICE and before the proliferation of 24/7 surveillance machinery, today managed through things like alternatives to detention or owing to the very lucrative big business detention to deportation complex that imprisons safety seekers indefinitely for profit, I might add, but neither trapping people who have committed no crime in for-profit prisons, nor forcing them into homelessness, for example, under the migrant protection protocols, for example, in some of the most dangerous places on earth, in northern Mexico border towns, where they are preyed upon by gangs and cartels, is the answer to what we should be doing as the so-called exemplar of freedom and beacon of hope.
I find myself with two minds. I find myself agreeing a lot with the picture that you paint, but at the same time, I'm thinking, well, I hear my friends on the right saying, okay, yes, on the asylum part of it, arguing, but given the fact that something like, depending on the figures in the month, the year, that between 60 to 70% or more of people who apply for asylum are not going to be granted asylum, at least in our current system, that seems to be a pretty strong incentive for folks to not show up for their asylum hearing. And that's what I hear a lot from the right, is that people are coming here knowing that they don't have a legitimate asylum claim, at least not one that will be approved. That's a little bit different from calling it legitimate. And so they just want to escape into the country, lie low, understandably so, because they're escaping some horrible stuff, but that still creates a significant public policy problem.
I don't disagree, but part of the problem is that we've cut off any other means of I don't disagree, but there are two other issues that we could deal with at the policy level. On the one hand, people are coming in and asking for asylum because it's the only means left to them, right? All other opportunities or potentialities for coming into the United States, rejoining their families and obtaining potentially better life have really been cut off to them. So if your only means is to request asylum and hope you get put into that pipeline, you're going to avail yourself to that. The other issue, though, is that our asylum definition was created before there were transnational criminal organizations preying on, the lives of people who really don't want to leave, right? We need to also be thinking about how our global refugee protection regime has failed us in the 21st century, in an era where security is paramount, in an era where our planetary home is on the brink of extinction. There are so many other forces at play now that are causing people to flee, that they all think that they are fleeing persecution and eligible for asylum because they are fleeing persecution. They just might not be the persecution definition written into the code right now. So there's also that potential flaw in the system, that they believe themselves to be persecuted, and they are, but it doesn't necessarily fall into the current definition of asylum. So we just need to update it all, but there's just no political will to do so.
Yeah, and I certainly would be completely on board with a broad and actually a redefinition of asylum that is more opening and welcoming and allows more people to get that asylum status. But of course, that's not the case. But even if we believe that doing this is the right thing to do from a humanitarian perspective, which I certainly do, I think another thing that folks will argue, and certainly Donald Trump argues this all the time, is that, well, if you open the borders like that, then you have all these criminals come into the United States. Not only that, but you have immigrants come in who take jobs from Americans during, like, for instance, the first presidential debate, right? He talked about immigrants taking Black jobs, Hispanics jobs, and that's going to be the worst in our history, he said. And what's your response to those sort of claims?
Well, I like to answer that first by invoking a popular meme, which goes like this. I was a fruit picker until all those illegals showed up. In other words, it's nonsense. It's demagoguery. It's crazy talk, as only Trump can crazy talk. And it's fear mongering. But the more serious answer is this. We need newcomers. Immigration has always been a net positive for societies. And in the U.S. right now, we have labor shortages. We have children doing the dangerous jobs of men because their fathers can't get north of the line. And we have a so-called GOP trying to roll back child labor laws to justify the exploitation of young people who should be in school. Their fathers should be allowed in to join them so that they can learn, right? We have zero population growth and an endangered social security system that would be given new life with the tax contributions of immigrants. Immigrants are historically hardworking, they're historically entrepreneurial, and all around us, our infrastructure systems are dying or they're becoming outmoded. We need newcomers far more than we need the racist fear-mongering kicked up by Trump and co. Also, immigrants make us a stronger, better, more creative, and more resilient society. So I just think, turn off Fox News and stop listening to him.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, obviously. But I think also when I think about the issue as it is today, I think it's maybe a different issue, say, from me sitting here in Cincinnati than someone in, say, I don't know, El Paso or some other border community. And I have a certain, I guess, sympathy for people in border communities who have to deal with inflow of large numbers of generally very poor people coming into the country. And I wonder, it seems to me they're right to feel that they're being essentially left out to dry without nearly enough assistance from somewhere, the federal government, state government, what have you, to deal with the consequences that they have to face much more so than policymakers in D.C. or people who are so far removed from the border. So what do you tell people in those border communities who are struggling to deal with this?
Well, first of all, I would invoke that there are many, many people in the border communities, and a lot of them are in my book, who are showing us the way forward. They're doing it every day, 24/7. They're so busy that it's impossible to get their voices heard beyond the 100-mile checkpoint. And it was that inspiration, right? The inspiration of one of the borderlanders in my book who said, capture our stories and take them north with you. Tell the people above the 100-mile CBP jurisdiction line, which is another thing people don't know. They don't know that our entire country is encircled in this 100-mile policing zone that's the jurisdiction of Customs and Border Protection, in which the Fourth Amendment no longer applies. But this inspiration to take our tales, take them north, show the people north of the line that there is another way, that not all borderlanders feel as aggrieved as, say, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, right? And speaking of Greg Abbott, I would point out that he has spent roughly $4 billion to date, not educating Texas children, not bolstering the worst medical system in the country, but erecting walls of concertina wire and shipping containers. He's trafficking people to blue cities for sport, to make a political point, not to help people. He's taken over public lands to build a boondoggle military fort to fight an invasion that does not exist. This is money that could be spent on providing a sandwich and a shower. So the stories of my frontline responders in the book do reveal that it costs the U.S. taxpayer a lot less money to offer a sandwich, a shower, a handshake, a bus ticket to the loved ones anxiously waiting for them. It's not only better for the soul of our nation to choose welcome over walls and militarization, it's also a much better way to spend our tax dollars, whether state or federal. I would much rather see our money being spent on educating the future leaders of our nation and ensuring that their mental and physical health is up to par than to throw it away on more guns and more cops and more bollards and more barbs.
Looking back just a few years into the past, do you think it was reasonable during the beginning and the height of the COVID pandemic for the Trump administration to invoke Title 42 and turn away migrants in order to, at least ostensibly, slow the spread of a pretty deadly thing?
Well, let's look at this rationally and logically, which was not necessarily a habit of his own. COVID was already in the United States and spreading fast when he invoked Title 42. And for our listeners who don't know what that is, it's a very obscure provision in our health code that dates back to the 40s that enables border officials to stop somebody from crossing the line if they are known to carry a communicable disease that might infect a population that has not yet had exposure to that disease. But COVID was already well underway, well on its way to infecting our population when Trump closed the border to people in motion. He did not close it to truck traffic. That was not affected. Tens of thousands of trucks still cross the line every month. He did not invoke it to affect local communities. Borderlanders and goods were allowed to continue to cross the line liberally without testing or any other kind of COVID controls. He didn't even believe that the disease was a thing. He called it a hoax at the same time that he invoked Title 42. Only those seeking safety at our southern border were thwarted from crossing the line under Title 42. So no, it was not reasonable. It was targeted, and it was a deep injustice. Unfortunately, it was a deep injustice that Biden failed to rectify for more than 2 years, though he promised to lift it on day one of his administration. And what's more, it gave Border Patrol officers immunity to expel everyone as quickly as possible without due process under the law, thus further shifting the Overton window as to what injustice is acceptable, quote unquote, at our borders. It was an abomination.
And certainly a lot of Americans believe that we have a crisis at the border. There was one of many, right, 2024 poll that I pulled up in preparation. There's something like 61% of Americans see illegal immigration as a very serious problem. Almost all Republicans, like 91%, 58% of independents, even 41% of Democrats. And all of those numbers in historical context are a big jump from even a decade ago. And so I guess, do you think that the majority of the American public is right in seeing illegal immigration as not just a really serious problem, but clearly much more serious of a problem than it was 10 years ago?
You know, I think it goes back to your previous question that I pointed out was flawed in its logic. The polling, too, also reflects this flawed moral frame that illegal and asylum are the same, right? So the questions that the pollers are asking are probably wrong. I think that most people have been sort of primed to believe that all immigration is illegal by the disinformation machine that has been churning away behind the scenes, really dating back to the Reagan era, and is largely anti-immigrant. So we just need to, re-educate the community, which is a big reason why I wrote this book, that asylum is not legal. It is not illegal. That things like the flawed mental framework that underlies these polling reinforced the misapprehension that it is, and that it's a dangerous misapprehension that is being exploited by the anti-immigrant right. So yes, on the one hand, I think the public is correct in seeing that there is a problem, but we're not asking the right questions. And in my tour across the United States, in launching this book, I have really perceived a hunger on the part of the public on both sides of the aisle for a narrative with clarity on this issue. I think folks are seeing the problem is that they have not been fed a narrative with clarity on this issue, that they're being fed slogans and lies. They've been duped by the right-wing disinformation machine for so long that same Overton window of acceptability on the issue just keeps shifting further and further and further to the right, such that these days, even CNN now sounds like more like Fox News on the issue. So I believe if given the correct information, that folks would not necessarily see people coming across the border as the issue, as the crisis. What I think the crisis is the hardening of the human heart, where we live in a nation where empathy seems to have expired and where we're not asking the right question. We're not asking, why are they coming, and responding to that. We're only asking, how do we stop them, and responding to that. And the only response to that question is more violence.
So it's pretty clear that you do not think the Biden administration is doing a bang-up job at the border here. And so we've been talking a lot about problems and responses that have been ineffective or inhumane or some combination thereof. So let's turn toward solutions that you think would help. And so let's start with some things, because as you pointed out, the political will is not really there for any kind of major changes to our policy, whether it's rewriting asylum laws or doing really anything except for a lot more border security, which you think is the wrong way to go. So let's say you were an advisor to President President Biden on this. What are some things you think that the administration could do unilaterally that would make this situation better?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, again, going back to our asylum laws, that's on the books. So we don't need Congress to enact any kind of reform. We don't need them. In fact, we can't rely on them. We haven't been able to rely on Congress for years, for decades at this point. But if we simply chose to abide by the laws that are already on the books, then we would bolster our asylum system. So when the shift in the communities coming across our southern border, we've effectively been talking mostly about immigration at the southern border, but that's only one piece of the very big pie. But focusing on that again, until the 21st century, let's say, folks, the majority of people who arrived at the southern border were largely men. They were largely looking for work. They were primarily Mexican. We did have refugees coming across as a result of our dirty wars, for example. But the system was sort of built to manage the comings and goings of migrant men looking for work, right? And then things changed. And in the 21st century, first under Bush 43 and then under Obama Biden, we started to see families and children coming on their own and mothers with babies, running from serious violence. That should have triggered the bolstering of our asylum system, but it didn't. So from 2014 to 2019, the number of claims had grown fivefold, and our systems for dealing with that did not keep pace. Then Trump and co., Stephen Miller, they attacked that weakness, and they really decimated the asylum system almost completely. So the one thing we could do is abide by our own laws, abide by our own rules and our own practices, and build that system back up again with immigration judges and asylum officers who can conduct credible fear interviews. We need to be able to make that process work for each and every individual within a year. That would be ideal. And we could do it. We just have to have the political will or the presidential will to make those hires. Another solution would be and is to provide pathways to legalization besides asylum. And one bright light that the Biden-Harris administration has brought us is the CHNV program, the program for Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans that allows them to apply for protection from home and then once approved, fly in. So they don't have to go through that perilous Central American and Mexican gauntlet. They don't have to come up through the Darien Gap. It actually has worked. It's been very, very humane, and it's allowed for, a good number of people to come in legally and without chaos at our border. We should also be letting Customs and Border Protection do the job that it is trained to do. They are the law and order folks that should be stopping baddies and drugs at our borders, that should be stopping drugs and baddies from flowing north and stopping our guns from flowing south, which is what's happening there. The drugs come north, the guns go south, and they go at this choke point at Customs and Border Protection. Let them do that job. They are not trained, and they don't have the appropriate moral framework to deal with the humanitarian mission that our first responders, and I should say our first responders that are today being criminalized, are attempting and actually very successfully doing. We need us to establish a parallel system of people trained and funded to care for real human needs and to do the job of welcome. We need, ultimately we would need Congress to agree to fund that by taking money away from the ever-growing, explosive, expansive boondoggle budget of DHS to, provide law and order all the time. That we can't do right yet without a Congress that actually works. But we could also, like I said before, interrogate why people are running and take responsibility for what we have done in our foreign and economic policies to create the forced human displacement we're now trying to stop, and respond to that correctly. Because here's the thing, Mike, everybody should have the right to migrate, right? Everybody should have the right to run from harm and horror and hunger and seek better. But everybody should have the right to stay home too. And most people want to stay home. It's the rare individual that will pull up stakes, leave family, leave community, leave their language group, leave everything they've ever known, and go through the perilous Central American gauntlet, Mexican gauntlet, run the risk of dying crossing the border, run the risk of being imprisoned in our for-profit immigration prison system for years on end. It's the rare person who will put themselves in that kind of danger. Only people who put themselves in that kind of danger, they do so because it's more dangerous to stay. So we really need to start thinking very seriously as a nation about what responsibility we have for the reasons for human displacement and respond to that so people don't have to move anymore.
I mean, I'm certainly with you on almost all of that. That'd make me king of America, and I would pour billions into not only allowing us to bring more people in and support them as they become part of our economy and the American culture, but also to help our neighbors to the south in ways that make people who would rather stay in their own countries where they were born and raised and their families are than make often perilous journeys. But then I come back to reality. I'm not going to be king of America. And I think about, say, at least the near-term future, where the odds are Donald Trump's going to be president. We're going to have probably a Republican Senate and maybe a small Democratic majority in the House. And so I struggle mightily to find any way to feel optimistic about immigration, at least in the short term. And so I want to feel optimistic. I always like to close on an optimistic note. Maybe you can give me some grounds for that. I would love that.
Oh my gosh, I wish I could. The picture you paint is the most pessimistic, and unfortunately, it's looking a little too real all the time. If our listeners have not checked out Trump & Co.'s Project 2025, they really should, because even if they are dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, they should run from Project 2025 with every vote that they can cast. So on the most pessimistic side, Project 2025 is just going to obliterate the United States systems as we know it. And one pertaining to this issue, they are proposing to make, as an everyday diet, concentration camps for folks in our country who are here without status. We're talking about people who are married to U.S. citizen spouses, for example. We're talking about people who have U.S. citizen children who might have been in this country for 10, 15, 20 years, who are part and integral to our communities. They're not just talking about bad guys. They're talking about penalizing not people who are here and penalizing them for their illegal acts, but penalizing them for their illegal presence, rounding them up, much as they did during their first immigration, with ICE raids, knocking people's doors down, grabbing moms and dads at soccer games and in the line for the bus stop. They're talking about school bus stop. They're talking about rounding these people up, holding them in concentration camp-like settings, such as we saw in Tornillo, Texas, and Homestead during the first administration, and then deporting them in what I call boxcars in the sky. If you go to the climax chapter of my book, it describes what actually happens on an ICE air flight. And I'm here to tell you, it isn't pretty, and it is in violation of almost every law on and torture convention on the books. And this is what this administration is planning to do. It's the snake eating its own tail, right? It will only harm our country and all the other stuff that they're talking about doing with regard to the education system and DOJ and everything. Just read Project 2025. I implore you. hopefully that will wake enough people up so that we can look to a more optimistic future, which is at least vote for the guy who still believes in democracy and then hold his feet to the fire to upgrade our immigration system such that we stop seeing folks in need of safety as migrants, as illegals, as aliens. As soon as you apply labels like this, the dehumanization begins. We need to see them as people, their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, their brothers, their aunties, their uncles. As I said before, they all have a story, much as our ancestors did. I mean, we're only here, unless you're Native American, because your ancestors came running from harm or hunger or horror, or running to just something better, a new opportunity. So we need to see these people much as we see ourselves and the legacies that our families, gifted to us, and really think about the humans that are caught up in this system and not the illegals and the aliens. So that's as best as I can do. I hope.
No, absolutely. And I should point out, some listeners will say, well, wait a second, Donald Trump has disavowed any sort of connection with Project 2025. And in response to that, I would say that that's absolutely the case. But if you think about the policy issues that seem to most animate Donald Trump, immigration would have to be at the top of the list, and that sort of dehumanizing the use of the term animals and that sort of thing definitely seems to fit into the general thrust of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, you're right. He disavowed it, but really out of one side of his mouth, I think, just like he said anyway, we can debate that forever. But, the fact of the matter is the guy has no platform. All he's got is hating on immigrants and fear mongering and building up a sense that, we're under threat. We're not under threat. We're the United States of America, and we can and we must do better.
All right. Well, that is at least a somewhat optimistic sort of a thing to strive for, I guess, rather than doing better as a country. And maybe that's the best we can get. And so, on that, I'm going to call it an optimistic note. We will close. Sarah Tal, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you. I'm really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,